Daniel Gray had always preferred to keep his business ventures quiet. At 42, he'd built a modest empire through strategic investments in healthcare facilities across 3 states. The Riverside Medical Center was his crown jewel, a majority stake acquired 5 years ago through a shell corporation that kept his name off public records. Only the hospital's board and chief financial officer knew his true identity. His wife Claire didn't know. She'd been a surgical nurse at Riverside for 8 years, and he'd never mentioned it. There had never been a reason to. Their marriage had been stable, comfortable, built on mutual respect and understanding. Or so he'd thought. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening when Daniel stopped by the hospital to drop off Claire's forgotten lunch. He'd texted her, but she hadn't responded, so he decided to bring it up to her floor. As he stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor, he saw her immediately, standing close to a man in a white coat near the nurse's station. Too close. Dr. Nathan Pierce. Daniel recognized him from staff photos he'd reviewed during quarterly reports. Cardiology department, recently recruited from a prestigious facility in Boston. Excellent credentials, slightly arrogant during his interview process, but the board had approved him anyway. Daniel watched as Claire laughed at something Nathan said, her hand briefly touching his arm. The gesture was familiar, intimate. Not the touch of colleagues, but of people who knew each other's bodies. The realization hit him like a physical blow, but he remained motionless, hidden partially behind a supply cart. Tonight then. Nathan's voice carried down the hallway. My place. Claire glanced around, not carefully enough to spot Daniel, and nodded. I'll tell him I'm working late. He never questions it. Daniel set the lunch bag on a nearby chair and left quietly. In the parking garage, he sat in his car for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, mind racing. His first instinct was confrontation, but something held him back. Maybe it was the businessman in him, the part that always calculated before acting. Maybe it was the part that had learned patience in boardrooms and negotiations. He drove home and called his attorney, Victoria Hayes, who'd handled his acquisitions for a decade. I need to know everything, he said simply. How long, how serious, what they're doing at the hospital. Victoria didn't need details. I'll have someone start tomorrow. Daniel, are you sure you want to go this route? I'm sure I want the truth. What I do with it, I'll decide later. The investigation began immediately. Within 3 days, Daniel had a preliminary report. The affair had been ongoing for 4 months. It had started at a hospital fundraiser, progressed through late-night consultations, and evolved into regular meetings both at Nathan's apartment and in various hospital locations. That last part interested Daniel most. He began visiting the hospital more frequently, always in the evening, always dressed in casual clothes that made him look like any other visitor. He learned the rhythms of the 4th floor, the blind spots in camera coverage, the unused storage rooms and empty offices. He watched them together, the stolen kisses, the whispered conversations, the way they'd disappear for 20-minute intervals during her breaks. He documented everything with his phone, timestamps, locations, witness statements from other staff members who gossiped freely around someone they assumed was just waiting for a patient. The security footage, which he could access through his position on the board, told the rest of the story. But it wasn't just the affair that caught his attention. It was the sloppiness, the complete disregard for hospital policy. Nathan accessing Claire's computer with her login credentials to falsify break times. Claire helping Nathan bill for consultations that never happened. Both of them using hospital resources, rooms, equipment, supplies, for personal matters. Each violation went into a growing file on Daniel's home computer. He felt oddly detached from his own pain, as if he were observing someone else's life falling apart. The hurt was there, certainly, a constant ache beneath his ribs, but it was buried under layers of calculation and planning. 3 weeks into his surveillance, Daniel made his decision. He wouldn't confront them. He wouldn't create a scene. He would simply let the consequences of their choices unfold naturally. After all, he owned the board. Daniel's home office became his command center. He'd installed a second monitor, created encrypted folders, and began organizing evidence with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Every evening after Claire left for her shift, he'd review the day's footage, cross-reference timestamps, and add to his growing documentation. The security system at Riverside Medical Center was extensive, camera coverage in every hallway, elevator, parking area, and public space. As majority owner, Daniel had full access through the board's security portal. What he discovered went beyond a simple affair. On March 15, at 2:47 a.m., cameras showed Nathan and Claire entering exam room 7 on the 4th floor. They emerged 43 minutes later. The room's electronic log showed no scheduled patients. A janitor who'd spoken with Daniel's investigator mentioned finding wine glasses in the trash the next morning. On March 22, Claire used her credentials to access the pharmacy supply room 3 times in 1 week, always when Nathan needed samples for patient consultations that never appeared in any medical records. The pharmacy director, reviewing inventory discrepancies for an unrelated audit, had flagged the pattern but hadn't yet pursued it. April 3 brought the most egregious violation. Nathan had used Claire's nurse login to enter patient records he had no authorization to access. He'd then billed insurance companies for consultations with those patients, consultations that never occurred. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate detection, but over 3 months, they totaled nearly $15,000. Daniel compiled it all: 47 policy violations, 18 instances of fraudulent billing, 12 breaches of patient confidentiality, and countless misuses of hospital resources. Each incident was time-stamped, documented with video evidence or electronic records, and corroborated by witness statements his investigator had carefully gathered. But he didn't stop there. He attended board meetings he'd previously handled remotely, sitting in the conference room's back row where board members knew him but staff typically didn't recognize him. He listened to concerns about staff morale, equipment utilization, and department performance. Nathan's name came up twice, once praised for his surgical success rates, once noted for his unusual number of after-hours consultations that seemed to generate minimal billable revenue. Dr. Pierce is talented, the chief of surgery admitted during one meeting, but something feels off about his practice patterns. I can't put my finger on it. Daniel said nothing, but he made notes. He also began to notice Claire's changes at home. She was more distant, more secretive with her phone. She showered immediately after coming home, even on days when she claimed to have worked in administration. She wore new perfume, styled her hair differently, bought clothes she'd never have chosen before. One evening, she came home from a late shift smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't Daniel's. She kissed his cheek absently and went upstairs, her phone glued to her hand. Daniel watched her go, then returned to his office and reviewed that evening's security footage. She'd never entered the hospital. Instead, cameras in the parking garage showed her getting into Nathan's BMW at 7:15 p.m. They didn't return until 11:43 p.m. Daniel added it to the file. The hardest part wasn't the documentation, it was the pretending. Every morning, he made coffee and asked about her day. Every evening, he asked how work had gone. When she complained about being tired, he suggested she cut back on overtime. She'd smile, kiss his forehead, and say the extra money was worth it. The money she wasn't actually earning. By mid-April, Daniel had enough evidence to destroy both their careers 10 times over. But he waited, watching the calendar, timing everything. The hospital's board had its quarterly review scheduled for the first week of May. The chief medical officer's contract was up for renewal. And most importantly, the hospital's new ethics compliance program, one Daniel had quietly advocated for, would go into effect May 1st. The pieces were falling into place. Victoria called one evening as Daniel was reviewing his documentation. The investigator found something else, she said carefully. Are you sure you want to know? Tell me. Nathan's married too. Wife and 2 kids in Boston. She has no idea he's here. He told his family he's doing a 1-year solo fellowship. Daniel closed his eyes. Another family destroyed. More lives damaged by carelessness and selfishness. Document it, he said quietly. Everything. The transformation in Daniel was subtle but profound. Friends who saw him during this period would later say he seemed calmer, more focused, almost serene. It was the serenity of someone who'd stopped fighting against reality and had instead chosen to work with it. He began spending more time at Riverside, but never in ways that drew attention. He'd visit the cafeteria during lunch rushes, sitting alone with a newspaper and coffee, invisible among the crowd of visitors and staff. He'd walk the corridors in the evening, clipboard in hand, looking like any administrative consultant reviewing facilities. The hospital staff never noticed him, but he noticed everything about them. He saw how other nurses regarded Claire, some with friendship, others with barely concealed disapproval. In the cafeteria one afternoon, he sat 2 tables away from a group of surgical nurses having lunch. "I'm just saying," one woman muttered, stirring her soup. "Some people need to remember we have professional standards. Making eyes at doctors during rounds isn't a good look." "Is it that obvious?" another asked. "Please. Everyone sees it." "I'm surprised her husband hasn't figured it out." Daniel kept his expression neutral, his newspaper raised just enough to obscure his face. He observed Nathan too, noting the cardiologist's supreme confidence bordering on arrogance. Nathan held court in the doctor's lounge, regaling younger physicians with stories of complex procedures and Boston's competitive medical environment. He name-dropped prestigious institutions, mentioned research papers he'd co-authored, and subtly positioned himself as superior to his Riverside colleagues. But Daniel also saw the cracks. Nathan cut corners in documentation. He delegated responsibilities inappropriately. During one surgery observation, Daniel watched from the gallery, anonymously. Nathan grew visibly frustrated with a resident's question and made a demeaning remark that made the entire surgical team uncomfortable. The chief of surgery had noticed too. Daniel saw her watching Nathan with increasing skepticism. At home, the charade continued. Claire would kiss Daniel goodbye each morning, promise to text during her breaks, and then disappear into a web of lies. He'd stopped checking her location after the first week. He didn't need to. The security footage told him everything. Some evenings, when she was supposedly working late, Daniel would watch her and Nathan on the 4th-floor cameras. They'd grown bolder, more careless. They'd hold hands walking down hallways. Nathan would pull her into empty exam rooms between patients. Once, they'd actually argued near the nurse's station, something about Nathan's wife calling unexpectedly and Nathan not answering because he'd been with Claire. The argument had drawn attention. 2 other nurses had watched with undisguised interest, and Daniel knew the hospital gossip network would be buzzing by the next shift. He documented that too. In late April, Daniel attended a board meeting where the hospital's new chief compliance officer presented the updated ethics policy. The policy was comprehensive: mandatory reporting of relationships between staff and physicians, strict protocols for accessing patient records, zero tolerance for billing irregularities, and automatic termination for anyone using hospital resources for personal matters. The policy goes into effect May 1st, the compliance officer explained. "We'll be running retroactive audits for the past 6 months to establish baselines and identify any existing violations." Daniel had helped draft that policy. He'd also suggested the retroactive audit window, exactly long enough to capture everything Nathan and Claire had done. Around the conference table, board members nodded approval. The hospital's reputation depended on ethical operations. Recent scandals at other facilities had made everyone cautious. "Any violations found in the audit?" asked one board member. "Full investigation protocol," the compliance officer confirmed. "Documentation, interviews, and if warranted, termination regardless of position or tenure." Daniel watched the chief medical officer shift uncomfortably. The CMO had hired Nathan over some objections, had praised him publicly. This wouldn't reflect well on his judgment. That evening, Daniel came home to find Claire in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner. She seemed happier than she'd been in months, lighter, as if carrying on the affair had somehow freed her rather than trapped her. "Good day?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. "Really good," she said, smiling brightly. "The hospital's implementing this new ethics program. They had a big presentation today. It's going to make everything more professional." Daniel poured himself a glass of wine. "That sounds excellent. Accountability is important." "Exactly." She kissed his cheek, oblivious. "I'm proud to work somewhere with such high standards." He raised his glass in a silent toast to irony. May 1st arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of bright spring morning that promised new beginnings. For Daniel, It marked the beginning of the end. The ethics compliance audit began immediately, overseen by a specialized firm Daniel's board had hired. They worked quietly, reviewing 6 months of electronic records, security footage, access logs, and billing data. The hospital staff barely noticed them, just another group of consultants with badges and laptops, occupying a converted conference room on the second floor. Daniel received daily briefing emails, encrypted and detailed. By May 3rd, the auditors had flagged Nathan's billing irregularities. By May 5th, they'd identified Claire's pharmacy access patterns. By May 7th, they'd compiled video evidence of policy violations that went far beyond what even Daniel had documented. But Daniel wasn't the only one watching anymore. On May 8th, Claire came home agitated. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary and poured herself wine without speaking. "Bad day?" Daniel asked from the living room, where he was reading. "There are auditors at the hospital. They're reviewing everything, access logs, schedules, electronic records. Everyone's on edge. Standard procedure, isn't it? For the new compliance program. I guess." She took a long drink. "It just feels invasive. Like they don't trust us." "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," Daniel said mildly. "If everyone's following the rules." She didn't respond, staring into her wine glass with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. Worry? Guilt? Fear? The following week brought more changes. Nathan's surgical schedule was quietly reduced, routine administrative review, the official memo claimed. The chief of surgery had requested it after the auditors flagged concerns about his documentation practices. Nathan complained loudly in the doctor's lounge, unaware that the walls were metaphorically closing in. Claire became increasingly anxious. She checked her phone obsessively, jumped when it rang, and developed insomnia that kept her pacing the house at 2 a.m. Daniel would hear her downstairs, talking in urgent whispers on the phone. He never followed, never eavesdropped. He didn't need to. On May 15th, the auditors delivered their preliminary report to the board. Daniel read it alone in his home office, the weight of evidence crushing in its thoroughness. 49 policy violations involving Nathan Pierce and Claire Gray. $18,000 in fraudulent billing. 12 patient confidentiality breaches. Sufficient grounds for immediate termination and potential criminal referral. The report also documented something Daniel hadn't fully realized. Nathan had been conducting his affair with Claire while still legally married, having lied on his employment application about his marital status. That alone violated his contract's morality clause. Victoria called that evening. The board meets tomorrow to review the report. They'll vote on recommended actions. I know. Daniel, you need to recuse yourself from the vote. Conflict of interest. Already planned to. I'll attend the meeting but won't participate in the decision. And Claire? What are you going to do about Claire? He was quiet for a long moment. I haven't decided yet. The next morning, Daniel left the house before Claire woke. He drove to Riverside and entered through the executive entrance, taking the private elevator to the boardroom on the 7th floor. The meeting began at 8 a.m. sharp. The compliance officer presented the findings with clinical precision. Video evidence played on the large screen, Nathan and Claire entering and leaving exam rooms, accessing restricted areas, the pharmacy incident, the falsified records. It was damning, unambiguous, and thoroughly documented. Around the table, board members' expressions ranged from anger to disappointment to resignation. Recommendation, the board chair asked. Immediate termination for both employees, the compliance officer stated. Dr. Pierce for fraudulent billing, policy violations, and contract misrepresentation. Nurse Gray for aiding in fraudulent activities, unauthorized access violations, and misuse of hospital resources. Additionally, we recommend referral to the State Medical Board and potential law enforcement involvement for the billing fraud. Daniel sat silently in the back row, his face impassive. All in favor of accepting the compliance officer's recommendations. 8 hands rose immediately. 1 board member abstained. Daniel didn't vote. Motion carries. The chief medical officer will handle the terminations today. It was done. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Nathan Pierce and Claire Gray were called separately to Human Resources. Daniel wasn't present for either meeting. He'd already left the hospital, driving aimlessly through the city, his phone turned off. Claire came home at 4:37 p.m., and Daniel heard her car in the driveway before he saw her. The engine cut off, but she didn't immediately come inside. He watched from the living room window as she sat motionless behind the wheel, her head dropped forward onto the steering wheel. When she finally entered the house, her eyes were red and swollen. She stood in the doorway, holding a cardboard box of personal items from her desk, and looked at Daniel with an expression of complete devastation. "I was fired," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel set down his book. "What happened?" "They said," her voice broke. "Policy violations. Improper conduct. They had video evidence, security footage, everything." "Daniel, Was it true?" he asked quietly. "What they accused you of?" She couldn't meet his eyes. The box slipped from her hands, spilling framed photos and a coffee mug onto the hardwood floor. Neither of them moved to pick it up. "How long?" Daniel asked. "What?" "How long have you been having an affair with Dr. Nathan Pierce?" The color drained from her face. "You knew." "I've known for 6 weeks. I've watched you lie to my face every single day. I've watched you betray your profession, your marriage, and your integrity." His voice remained calm, almost conversational. "What I want to know now is why." Claire collapsed onto the couch, her whole body shaking. "I don't know. I don't know. He made me feel important, seen. You're always so distant, so focused on your work. Nathan paid attention to me." "Did he tell you he has a wife and 2 children in Boston?" Her head snapped up. "What?" "He lied on his employment application. He's married. Claire. You were the other woman to his other woman." The sound she made was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, bitter and broken. "Of course he did. Of course." They sat in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, highlighting the ruins of their life together. "Nathan was fired too," she finally said. "They said he'll probably lose his medical license. The billing fraud, they're talking about criminal charges." "I'm not surprised. How can you be so calm about this?" Daniel stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "Because I've had 6 weeks to process it. 6 weeks to watch you throw away everything we built. 6 weeks to document every lie, every violation, every moment you chose him over us. You knew and you just watched. I owned the hospital, Claire." The silence that followed was absolute. "What?" Her voice was so small, so disbelieving. "Riverside Medical Center. I'm the majority shareholder. I bought it 5 years ago through a holding company. The board answers to me. The auditors I hired. The compliance program I helped design. All of it." She stood slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You engineered this. The investigation, the terminations, everything." "No." Daniel turned to face her. "I didn't engineer anything. I simply allowed the consequences of your choices to unfold naturally. You violated hospital policy. Nathan committed fraud. Those actions have consequences, regardless of who you're married to. But you could have stopped it. You could have warned me." "Why would I?" "So you could cover your tracks better? So Nathan could continue stealing from patients? You made your choices, Claire. I just made sure you faced the results." She sank back onto the couch, her face in her hands. "What happens now?" "Now." Daniel picked up the cardboard box, setting it on the coffee table. "Now you pack your things. I've had divorce papers drawn up. Victoria will send them over tomorrow. The house is mine, bought before the marriage, but I'll provide a reasonable settlement. You should probably find a lawyer." "Daniel, please. Can't we?" "No." His voice was firm but not unkind. "We can't. You made your choice months ago. This is just the reckoning." He walked to his office and closed the door, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her decisions. Through the door, he heard her crying, deep, wrenching sobs that might have moved him once. Now they were just the sound of consequences finding their target. Daniel sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The board had already begun the search for Nathan's replacement. The hospital would survive this scandal. Its reputation might even improve, once the story spread about their zero-tolerance approach to ethical violations. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Are you okay?" He considered the question. His marriage was over. His trust had been shattered. The woman he'd loved had betrayed him in the most fundamental way. But he'd faced it with dignity. He'd handled it professionally. He'd ensured that justice was served without drama, without public humiliation, without losing himself in the process. "I will be," he typed back. Outside his office, he heard Claire climbing the stairs, her footsteps heavy and slow. He heard drawers opening, the sound of a suitcase zipper, the quiet dismantling of a life. Daniel closed his laptop and looked out the window at the setting sun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the divorce proceedings, the hospital's recovery, rebuilding his life. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of closure. He'd been invisible in his power, patient in his pain, and precise in his response. He hadn't sought revenge or public humiliation. He'd simply stepped back and let the truth do its work. In the end, that was enough. The house fell silent as evening descended. Claire left around 8 p.m., her car disappearing down the street with 2 suitcases and a lifetime of regrets. Daniel didn't watch her go. Instead, he poured himself a drink and sat in the growing darkness, alone but not lonely, wounded but not broken. The consequences had been delivered. Justice, quiet and professional, had been served. And Daniel Gray, the invisible owner, the patient observer, the man who'd held all the power without anyone knowing, finally allowed himself to begin healing.